communications folks so we can start the meeting? As soon as I get their wave off, we'll begin. Okay. Folks, welcome to a very special meeting of the Tallahassee Historical Society. We're pleased to have each of you here with us tonight for our March meeting. You'll become a part of Tallahassee history because you'll be one of those persons present when I believe the mystery surrounding a crime that forever changed this city will finally be put to rest. First, let me introduce a couple of folks I've noticed in the audience. We have a delegation from Wakulla County. If you'd stand to be recognized, their historical society is here. Part of them. One of our ex-sheriff here, Eddie Boone, is present with us tonight. Eddie, thank you for being here. We have some law enforcement officials that have been retired that are here with us tonight. If y'all would raise your hands and let us see you. And I wouldn't want to overlook one person, Rocky Beavis. Rocky, where are you, fella? Rocky happened to be one of the very first persons on the scene of this crime when it took place. Is that correct, Rocky? Good. All right, we're not going through the formalities of a regular meeting. We're going to begin our program, but before we do, I do want to tell you a little bit about our Historical Society, what it is, what it does, and what we have an eye on for the future. The Tallahassee Historical Society was founded in 1933 to promote sharing of local and state history with interesting people in and about Tallahassee. In addition to presenting our monthly speakers and programs, the Society serves as a referral group for the citizens of Florida and elsewhere concerning historical happenings that have occurred in Tallahassee and its surrounding area. If you're interested in joining us, and some of you have already tonight, we'd be happy to have you as a new member. Membership is $20 a year for individuals, $30 for husband and wife, and we meet monthly, October through May, normally at the Governor Martin House on Lafayette Street, just up the street from the Department of Transportation. It's the DeSoto site out there. So we meet on the second Thursdays of each month at 7 a.m. Excuse me. Not for breakfast, but for supper. Okay. Now, have any of you ever seen this building before? I want to put it up here so let me hold this one. He's a good picture painter too. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the old city waterworks down here on Main Street right by Cascade Park. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's owned by the city of Tallahassee. It's sitting vacant. It's aching to become the Museum of Tallahassee History. We do not have a museum of Tallahassee history, as do most capital cities. Most of the large counties, or excuse me, most of the large cities in Florida have one. Quincy, Crawfordville, Monticello, but Tallahassee does not. And this building is absolutely a jewel. It's very unique, as you can see. There's not another building around it like it. And we have begun talking to your city government about this possibility. We'd like to make it happen. In 9 years, Tallahassee will celebrate its 200th anniversary. 9 years. Can you imagine what's going to happen in this town in 9 years? There's going to be a whale of a lot of preparation, and there's going to be a lot of things going on because we have a rich history, probably as rich a history as any city in the country. So we'd like to see that museum in full operation by that time. Many of you have grandma's relics up in the attic. You've got photographs of historical significance. Our archaeological society here in town certainly has artifacts. The State Museum has plenty of artifacts salted away that they can't show. We need that building. So if you hear anything about it in the future, and if you can support us, we'd love to have your support. So if you'd like to present us with your talents in making that happen, just give me a call at my home, David Lang Jr. That's the way I'm listed, but don't use that. Now, it's time to introduce our program for what you came to hear. Tallahassee has an unsolved crime that has rocked on for 49 years. And it still lingers in the mind of everybody that's lived here on that October day in 1966. Tonight, we hope to hear pretty much the full story of that crime with facts and evidence that have never been shared with the public before. And that's where you come in. You'll be part of that history. To do that, our speaker tonight, Henry Cabbage, will be presenting that program. Mr. Cabbage is a man with a deep love of history. Among other things, he's the author of Tallahassee Historical Tales, which has long been sold out. I'm hoping that Mr. Cabbage will republish that because it's a great book. And I do know that copies of that are selling for quite a high price. So I think, Henry, it'd be great to have that republished. However, his topic tonight, as you know well, is entitled Shivering with Fear. Following Mr. Cabbage's presentation, would you entertain questions or anything? Okay, that's great. And we'll have a mic. It will be handed to you. I'll bring it to you so that you can address the crowd and he can respond. Now, the man you've been waiting to hear, your speaker, Henry Cabbage.
Thanks, sir. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. I am Henry Cabbage, probably the only speaker you've had that's named after a vegetable. I'm supposed to be using this mic. Is this not working? You having trouble hearing me? All right, let's. All right, how about this? All right, I had hoped I could walk around and interact with everybody, but more important that you're here, I guess. Anyway, I did address this esteemed organization about 16 years ago when my book came out, which is actually titled Tales of Historic Tallahassee. And I thought this club would be a good place to sell some copies, so I came to talk to you. There were a couple of dozen people showed up, but tonight, wow. Well, anyway, I think I want to start out by telling you a little bit about what it was like that night, October 22nd, 1966. If you were here, you remember exactly where you were when you heard about this. It's like the Kennedy assassination. Everybody remembers. I heard about that in geometry class at so-and-so high school or wherever. And the Sims murder was so dramatic, it struck people like that. Tallahassee was a pretty quiet town. I'm not sure about how big it was. I thought it was about 100,000 people. It may have been less.
Much smaller.
Much smaller? Well, okay, well, I lived in Panama City at the time. I apologize for not knowing that detail. But it was a quiet town anyway, except for the noise that was coming from the FSU home game against Mississippi State at the stadium that night. Sounds also of children playing with firecrackers along Tharp Street. The police, in those days, I guess that was not a high priority police call because I did a lot of that too, when I was a kid. The weather forecast called for a good chance of rain and high temperature, 72 degrees, low of 62. Halloween was approaching. Children were excited about that. Tallahassee was a safe place to live. Residents didn't feel the need to lock the doors or keep loaded weapons handy to ward off danger. But this was to be the last night that defined the essence of Tallahassee. I'm from Panama City myself, and I remember back in the 60s, if we even had a key to our front door, I never saw it, we didn't need it. Even if we left town for the weekend, we didn't need to lock the doors. Just people in this part of Florida just felt safe. But the next day, this city shivered in fear. As Rocky Beavis, I'm so glad you're here because you're part of my talk here. As Rocky Beavis of the Beavis Funeral Home family put it, we woke up one morning in Tallahassee and we were part of an evil world. Sometime before midnight, a young deputy sheriff, whose name happened to be Larry Campbell, was just about to knock off for the night and head home to celebrate his 25th birthday. Then there came a call the sheriff's department got a call reporting 3 signal 7s. That's police lingo for 3 dead persons. He figured it must be a vehicle crash. So as he drove to the scene at 641 Muriel Court, just off Gibbs Drive near Tharp Street, he arrived at the scene and found Rocky Beavis and his father already there. They reported there were 3 bodies, apparently homicide victims, inside the home. They didn't know whether the killer was still there. A 17-year-old Jenny Sims, Virginia Sims, returning home from a babysitting job, was the first to discover the bodies of her parents and her 12-year-old sister. Her other sister, Judy, 15 years old, arrived home at about the same time. Local news media diligently covered the story, identifying the victims as Robert Sims, 42 years old, who would be 91 today. He was a computer expert at the Department of Education before they even were computer experts. His wife, attractive woman, I understand, Helen, 34, would be 83 today. She had recently left her position as a church secretary at Tallahassee's First Baptist Church, and the other victim was their daughter, Joy, who was 12 years old at the time, be 61 now. Evidence indicated Mrs. Sims died first. Mr. Sims died first, according to investigators. At 6'4" and more than 200 pounds, he would not have been easy to overpower in a physical confrontation, physical struggle, but he was blindfolded and shot once in his left cheek. The attackers evidently went after the little girl next, but Mrs. Sims was killed when she attempted to protect the child. Mrs. Sims had been tightly bound and died from 2 shots behind and above her right ear and another shot in her leg. She survived for a few days at Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. Now, the story about how long she survived at the hospital was kind of exaggerated by design, really. Even after she died, the investigators wanted the killers to believe she was still alive, so maybe they would do something stupid. It didn't work. Well, not exactly. Joy died in the bedroom. She had been gagged with a stocking and tied up, but not blindfolded. She saw both her parents die. She had been stabbed 6 or 7 times with a large double-edged knife and shot once in the right temple. Former late Sheriff Raymond Hamlin said that hardly describes how brutally she was mutilated. She was partially undressed and her inner thighs were bruised, but she evidently had not been raped, according to investigators on their preliminary findings. But subsequent information seemed to contradict that. None of the files I've seen confirm it, but at least one person close to the investigation told me that there was evidence that there were more than one killers, and at least one was a female. As word spread across the community, residents bought guns, knives, and locks. Women, according to the newspaper, bought water guns to fill with ammonia to ward off attackers. A nearby pond was drained to search for a murder weapon or other evidence. Now, that part about buying locks and guns and whatever you could use for a weapon, that sounds an awful lot like another murder that happened at the Florida State University's Calmega House, doesn't it? The way it just grabbed this town. Excuse me. Well, they drained this pond, didn't find any weapons in there. Halloween was all but canceled that year. Parents kept their children at home, and police with attack dogs patrol the streets. Women signed up for defense classes, self-defense classes. We have no suspects and no motive at this time, said investigators, who soon included the Leon County Sheriff's Department, State Attorney's Office, and the Sheriff's Bureau, now known as the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Leon County Sheriff James Joyce reported that 5 other sheriffs were tracking down information in other states, including Georgia. Then Governor Hayden Burns had state government kick in a $5,000 reward for information or for evidence in the case. The Sims were finally buried at a family plot in Meridian, Mississippi. 2 surviving daughters of the Sims went to live with an aunt in Huntsville, Alabama. I understand from what Sheriff Campbell told me, those 2 daughters did not want me to write a book, like many of you have told me tonight I ought to about this. But I'll tell you, even now, after a court battle that spanned 3 years, the bulk of investigative records in this case are exempt from disclosure to journalists and others, despite Florida's public records law. There is a provision in that public records law that Sheriff Campbell cited in this letter to me saying, all right, I'm going to release records to you, but I'm not going to release anything that we learned before January 25th, 1975, or 79. 79, there you go. That there is a provision in that law that I don't know where it came from, but it's there on the books. It says police investigative information gathered before January 25th, 1979 is exempt from disclosure. The police don't have to release it to you. Doesn't make any sense to me, so if you will go tell your uncle, the senator, that we need to repeal that law, I'd be grateful. But anyway, finally he did release some records to me, about 2,000 pages of them. Much of it was technical blood analysis and things like that wasn't all that helpful to me, but you know, at least they did release it. But what they did release was redacted. Confidential parts of it were blacked out, and much of it looked like that, or some of it looked like that. Most of it was pretty redacted. Okay. Now, since the crime occurred in 1966, everything that investigators found in the first 12 years of the investigation will likely do nothing but gather dust forevermore unless the agencies decide to release it. On the other hand, I have been able to get my hands on these 2,000 or more pages of documents, and this is what I found out. I learned that the killers used a .38 caliber gun and fired 6 shots. Investigators recovered all 6 bullets.
Talk in the mic a little better. They can't hear you.
Okay, I apologize. I've never been accused of being too quiet, but the gun was a .38 caliber, had 5 grooves in the barrel with a right-hand twist. If you know guns, you know this twist in the barrel makes the bullet spin around as it's coming at you, makes it go more straight. Some spin to the right, some spin to the left. Only one neighbor reported hearing any shots, and he wasn't sure. He just said about 11:20 p.m., and he heard some shots, 4 shots, in fact. He dismissed it as kids playing with fireworks, as had occurred earlier that evening. I've learned the Sims house was not in disorder. Miss Sims' purse and wallet were on a dresser, unopened. The television was on, cash and credit cards were undisturbed on a table, coin collection and jewelry were untouched. robbery wasn't the motive. A shotgun was on a shelf in the bedroom closet. The front and back doors were open, and there was no sign of forced entry. One neighbor reported hearing a shrill scream about 10 or 11 p.m., but decided it must have been a child playing. The radio was on in Joy's room. Might have been listening to the football game, the FSU, who knows. I understand the Sims weren't all that into football, and certainly a 12-year-old girl, I don't know. But anyway, then Leon Federal Savings and Loan offered another $1,000 reward for information about the crime. Now, when I first started writing about this case, Sheriff Campbell was not really willing to grant me an interview. At the time, I wanted to write a book about the case, but that grew to be more and more difficult when the agencies declined to release documents to me. And I understand why they did that. That's how police think, and you know, they do a fine job. In addition, the sheriff told me the surviving Sims girls did not want a book about the case to happen. He did loosen up a little a few years back and told me he was pretty certain he knew who committed the crime. And he expects the two suspects to reach a breaking point eventually. He said he'd call them now and then just to remind them he was on the case. He told me there are going to be a lot of shocked people if and when the crime is solved. The facts will prove much different than what people think, he said. There was a blood smudge on an outside wall by the back door and other physical evidence, but technicians could not match it to a suspect, nor did 1,000 fingerprints that they gathered from the scene. I think there were like 200 people took lie detector tests and things. You got to admit the investigators did really work to solve this case. A call to authorities revealed the Sims case was eerily similar to murders of the Clutter family in Kansas that inspired the Truman Capote book In Cold Blood. I read that book, and there was some similarities here. Another investigative reporter, Ron Stocks was his name, in 1986 contacted State Attorney Willie Meigs regarding his plan to write a 20-year anniversary of the Sims murder story. Meigs referred Stocks to investigator Al Gandy, and he got far more cooperation from Mr. Meigs than I did 12 years later. However, Stocks was focused on a potentially promising suspect named Thomas Fulgham, who was an inmate in Georgia, in a Georgia prison at the time, convicted of murdering and dismembering a woman in 1979. That sounded like somebody who would do something like the Sims murders. But Fulgham was 16 at the time, had been in Tallahassee the night of the murders, and lived near the Sims. He also had attended a rather rowdy party of some other teens whose parents were out of town for the night of the murders. Well, you know what teenagers can do with a party invitation when the parents are out of town. Fulgham later enrolled in a chiropractic school in Macon, but dropped out and became fanatically religious and paranoid schizophrenic. And that was a psychiatrist who gave him that title, not me, paranoid schizophrenic. He murdered the woman and dismembered her body because he felt she was the devil, and cut off his own little finger in obedience to commands from God. Investigators never found anything to connect Fulgham to the Sims murders, although he said he had met the oldest Sims daughter once. Fulgham died in prison. Sheriff Campbell told me he did not suspect that Fulgham was in any way involved in the Sims murders. Another promising suspect who came to investigators' attention 20 years after the murders, his name was Robert Howells. He actually confessed to the crime to his ex-wife and bragged about it to other people, but he didn't really do the murders. The day after he married his second wife, Peggy, he took her for a ride over to Alligator Point, she said, and on the way he told her Miss Sims had offended him at a supermarket. And so he followed her home to see where she lived. He said he returned later and killed the Sims, according to Peggy. Well, When investigators questioned Howells about his involvement in the case, however, he claimed his wife had mental health problems and accused him of the Sims murders and another murder, the all-day murder, if you remember that one. I don't. I wasn't here, I think. And as he said, she did that as a release from her own mental anguish. Investigators did not find anything to connect him to the murders other than this claim he made to his wife, and it was, you know, kind of in the context of, you watch out or I'll get you too, kind of thing like happens sometimes. In 1988, a woman notified investigators that her grandfather, Tom Racker, who has relatives in this room tonight, glad you're here, had lived across the street from the Sims. She told investigators her grandfather had a gun, and he denied owning it when police questioned him about it. Turns out the gun was a .45. The Sims were killed with 38. There was nothing to connect him to the crime, but it was a tip worth following up. A retired pediatrician named Dr. Roy Young, contacted authorities and told them he suspected his former wife may have been involved in the murders because he had learned she was having affairs with powerful politicians and the pastor of Tallahassee's First Baptist Church, the Reverend C.A. Roberts, who was also a suspect. Dr. Young's theory was that his ex-wife, his theory about the crime had no criminal substance, but to this day, some of the investigators and other officers who worked the case still cannot completely dismiss Reverend Roberts as a suspect. Now, Reverend Roberts was the team chaplain for the FSU football team. He was at the game that night. After the first half, he disappeared for a little while. People speculated, Reverend Roberts was known to be a womanizer, a rather successful one too, from what I've learned. I would have loved to hang out with him. But he, some speculate Miss Sims had been the a church secretary at the First Baptist Church. And some claim that she was having an affair with Reverend Roberts. I don't think she was. I never found any indication she was, but I do know that if Reverend Roberts knew her, he might have made a proposition to her. I don't know, but since Roberts was the chaplain for FSU team, he disappeared after the first half of the game, the night of the murders, but he returned after the halftime show. Now, many people thought that was suspicious, but Sheriff Campbell said officers tried all the possible routes from Doak Campbell Stadium to the Sims residence, and they concluded it would have been impossible for Roberts to leave the stadium, drive to the Sims residence, commit the murders, and return to the stadium within the time frame he was out of sight. Some speculated that Reverend Roberts had a cult following that could have done the murders for him. But none of the evidence released to me confirmed that, but Roberts did refuse to take a lie detector test. Can't blame him for that. I would decline to take one too. So investigative news reporter I am, I've seen many people that have done that and regretted it later. Anyway, the Reverend Roberts was terminated from his position with the church for his affairs. He followed Coach Peterson, then FSU coach, to Rice University, and later became the team chaplain for the Houston Oilers. He later died in a traffic accident in Texas. From what I understand, he was traveling, pulled off the road to rest, and his car was struck by another vehicle. A few years back, when I finally got Sheriff Campbell to release some records to me and grant me an interview, he told me he was pretty sure he knew who committed the murders, and he had enough evidence to get a grand jury to indict them. However, he doubted there was enough evidence to get a conviction in a trial. As you understand, if he took somebody, got an indictment, put them on trial, and they were acquitted, that was it. You could not put them on trial again. They could brag about how they did it, and you couldn't put them on trial again. Now, there are some ways you can prosecute them on federal charges or something, but you're really out of ammunition if you take somebody to trial before you've got the evidence. And that was why Sheriff Campbell and the other investigators, including FDLE and the state attorney's office, were so tight-mouthed about this. He said, though, that the sheriff said that early in the investigation, as he drove around town gathering information, he noticed a young woman kept showing up everywhere he went. And he got curious about that. He decided to find out who she was. She turned out to be Mary Charles LaJoy. She was a Leon High School graduate who lived on Von Sill Drive near the Sims, who lived on Muro Court. She lived a few blocks away from the Sims. The night of the Sims murders, she and her boyfriend, Vernon Fox Jr., attended a drive-in movie at Appalachia Parkway and Capitol Circle. I remember that theater. I used to drive past there on my way to Gainesville from Panama City. The movie plan was, it was a double feature. Doctor Who and the Daleks was playing, and the second feature was Munster Go Home. The couple left after Doctor Who and the Daleks because they'd already seen Munster Go Home, according to what she said. Now, as Campbell continued his investigation, he learned some strange things about the girl. He said her roommates at FSU were afraid of her. She slept in a funeral shroud. There's something that funeral homes use to apply makeup to a body. It's called a 5-in-1 kit, I think. That's what she used for makeup. And she had a sign over her bed. This was not in the records. This is something Sheriff Campbell told me. That she had a sign over her bed that said, "A tisket, a tasket, come sleep in my casket." All right, well, she and her boyfriend were both fascinated by dead things. And she said they used to park in the graveyard to make out. Now, Mary Charles, who had been adopted by the LaJoys, said she endured beatings and other mistreatment at home. She said she believed her birth parents were communists. Investigators never confirmed that for me, but she seemed to believe that. Her boyfriend's parents did not approve of her dating or his dating her, so she used to drive everywhere they went, and she would drop him off at the ball fields there at Gibbs Drive and Tharp Street, and he would walk home from there to conceal having been out on this date. Now this the Fox boy lived in a house that abutted the Sims house, just almost back door to back door. Now both of them, the Sims, or both the Fox boy and the Mary Charles LaJoy girl took polygraph tests, but they were inconclusive. Both said they had never really met the Sims, although they attended their funeral. They married later and divorced after a few years. Vernon joined the Air Force at one point, but suffered some kind of breakdown and was discharged during basic training. He wound up teaching in south of here, St. Petersburg. His ex-wife wound up in Jacksonville, living off of alimony. Now, fast forward to 1987. That's when Mary Charles Fox contacted then Major Larry Campbell and said she wanted to talk to him. Campbell arranged for transportation from Jacksonville for her and conducted 3 lengthy interviews with her and another officer present. And I'm going to play you some excerpts from these interviews. There were many other details I could tell you about these two, but I think the most interesting thing I can do is play you these excerpts of those interviews. Tape 1, Mary Charles LaJoy Fox says her mind would have blocked it out of her memory if she had been there at the time of the murders. And she did claim she didn't remember anything about that night after a certain point. In the second interview, she never confesses, never denies involvement. Just don't know, she said. Body language expert I know, I asked him to review these, and he said, you know, from her body language, you can't tell whether she's really guilty. What you can tell is that she just really wanted to get the sheriff after her ex-husband. Another woman, a friend of mine who's a social worker and has some experience dealing with people who have what we used to call multiple personality disorder. Today, the psychiatrists and psychologists call it dissociative disorder, but there were some things on her behavior that indicated that. Nothing conclusive, though. I'm certainly not qualified to make that diagnosis, but it was interesting. Up to this point, she had said, and when she first started this first interview, you know, she's sitting up straight on the edge of her chair, talked vaguely about a recollection of going to the Sims house, but said she couldn't be sure it really happened. Then the interview got interrupted by a phone call, and her demeanor changed. About an hour and a half into the second interview, she was no longer sitting on the edge of her seat. She was leaned back in her chair with her feet propped up on the sheriff's desk. All right, in the third interview, she talks about visiting the Sims house after the Nichols family moved in. She said that was the first time she remembered ever being there. In this interview, that's what she said. But she said she felt dark evil. She was scared. So there you are. Who killed the Sims? Nobody has been convicted. Nobody's ever even been arrested. It could have been one of these suspects. It could have been somebody that nobody's considered. There were serial killers like Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole running around Florida killing people about that time. Maybe it was them. Sheriff Campbell, though, believed that at some point the killers will no longer be able to live with their guilt and will admit what they did. We can only hope that he was right. Now, I'm going to play some excerpts from these interviews now. And one thing I need to tell you, when I'm making a speech like this, I try to watch my language. This individual being interviewed does not. This is not suitable for children. I don't see any children here, but anyway, just to let you know, if you're offended by that, what kind of language, this is a good time to leave, because she mentions everything I've ever heard of. All right. Okay, and
Good idea. All right, you said, okay, and Vernon had come up and told me, you know, that he was going to be, you know, all the way for the rest of his life. We'd never be together and all this kind of stuff because of the Sims girl. Okay. I think I will improvise a plan. You know, a very simple plan.
I can't hear it either.
Take care of the problem. Okay.
What she's saying at this point is that she had been there at the
Thank you. Vernon,
Sims house at the time of the murders.
you know, after, you
Yeah,
know,
you
maybe
can't hear me. Anyway, she's saying she had been there at the time of the murders and saw what apparently happened there. She would have freaked out and blocked it out of her mind and run home and never been able to remember it again, which is, as the tapes go on, that's what she claims. At one point, she will say she remembers going to the Sims house, knocking on the door, and a man answered, a dark-haired man answered. She blocked out, can't remember anything after that.
closed off because that would have destroyed totally
You know, I would caution you, just because she blatantly uses profanity all throughout this 6 hours on these tapes,
Now that,
well, profanity is not the same as murder. You know, I wouldn't assume she's guilty just because of that.
precedent, and that would have
She
been.
is one of three or four of the suspects that at one time or other have attempted suicide.
Yeah, whatever.
We're talking about the 22nd of October, 1966.
All right.
Right at 21 years since then.
Now, this is in 1987, by the way.
Do you think that makes sense? I may have seen my one and only love as he really was.
See, that's the thing, Charlie. It's not what I see makes sense. It's what you see makes sense.
That would make sense to me.
Where I'm coming from is that you and I talked 20 years ago. We covered a lot of territory in 2 years. You called me on the night before that, 13, 14, Monday night, like we're doing that. Out of the blue, well, Thursday, so said hi there.
Yeah.
Do you remember me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. And you never
Okay,
got
this is pretty preliminary stuff, just more or less getting acquainted here. But let's move on to a little deeper into the review process where Sheriff Campbell confronts her with some of the information.
get together and talk about this thing. So you said, yeah, all right. So Agent Mitchell went to Jacksonville, got you some shelter. I sit here yesterday.
Chance of the volume being up a little lower.
Can you turn the volume up a little? Yes, she's trying.
You want the first one or the second?
Do what?
The first one or the second one? This one has the two, right? Which one?
Oh, the first one down. Yeah.
Want to turn your piece up real quick?
Ready?
Okay. All right, you said, okay, if Vernon had come up and told me, that he was gonna be, all the way for the rest of his life, we'd never be together and all this kind of stuff, because of the Sims girl. Okay. I think I would have designed a plan. A very simple plan. Get in there, get out, take care of the problem. Okay. But I think if Vernon had, after, maybe the parents were not.
And you could be driving today.
I apologize for this. This last few seconds, but in this section of these interviews now, she begins to talk about hypotheticals. If I had been here and this had happened, then maybe I would have done so and so. But it's all hypotheticals. But it's interesting. She never confesses and never denies. And at one point in this particular segment, it's probably this hour and a half or so further on in, but she says, what if I suddenly remembered something that was helpful and helped you, solve this crime? What would happen to me? And, of course, the sheriff told her, well, you would probably be put in hospital or prison, which she interpreted immediately as committed to Chattahoochee, which probably would have been. And after that, she clams up. She not only clams up, her whole demeanor changes. They get interrupted by phone calls a few times, but at one point, about an hour and a half into this, they got interrupted again, and she pretended to shoot the phone pew, like that, leaned back, propped her feet up on the desk, and her whole demeanor changed after that. But she did say, what about this $10,000 reward? And Campbell didn't know what she was talking about, but apparently there was a total of $10,000 reward for information. And she thought, if I, were to turn myself in and confess to this, could I collect that $10,000 and get committed to a private mental hospital and avoid, being placed in Tallahassee? And Sheriff Campbell told her, I'm not going to promise you anything I can't deliver here, but he wasn't even sure there still was a $10,000 reward, and it would not be up to him if she went to a private hospital or Chattahoochee or McClenny or wherever. Anyway, on this tape, if you want to hear some more of this, we get a little further into her head here. But again, we don't know for sure that she's guilty. We just know that by this point, this has turned into a play for her.
You're in charge.
Well, that's what his parents,
And that he's hiding from you.
because he thinks I'm gonna go down there and blow his ass away.
You told me last night.
Yeah, damn, what if you'd been put in a situation like that? If you were me,
Those people would be alive today.
huh?
Those people would be alive today if I'd been put in that situation.
Yeah.
But see, what I got to looking at in my mind is that poor Charlie, out there alone in the world, mom and daddy don't really like her, thinks she's mean to his daughter, and that,
Yeah, I've heard this, yeah.
you brought it up, I didn't.
Yeah.
You've been beaten at home, you've been physically abused, you've been sexually abused, you've been psychologically abused. You don't have a peer group. You don't have anything except one young man named Vernon Fox, who in and of himself has got a bunch of problems. And living behind Vernon Fox, we have the all-American family living back there. Everybody's happy, everybody loves everybody, everybody is wonderful people, everybody likes them. Big deal in the state government, big deal in the church. Girls are every big thing in the high school that you like.
Okay, I guess that gives you the essence of the story. I've told you what I know about the Sims. I'm sorry I could not tell you I know who killed them, but I don't. Nobody does. Hope Sheriff Campbell was right that someday they'll just break and come forward. But I'll try to answer any of your questions I can now. If you will just raise your hand, and this nice lady with the okay, just pick one out and run over there.
Yes, did anyone ever try to contact Vernon Fox for a statement that would balance or in some way shed
Yes.
some light on what the young woman just said?
Yes, right after this, they had a hard time finding him, but he was working in St. Petersburg, teaching school down there. But later on, they finally decided, let's wade into this one more time. And they went down, interviewed him. He lawyered up just real quickly. And of course, the lawyer, as lawyers do, told him, don't say anything. That's where that story ended. Ma'am.
You said they collected lots of blood and stuff like this. Was there anything for DNA that could have been saved all these years? I know there wasn't DNA at that time, but there is now. Is there any evidence that's there that?
Yes. They did take these samples that were 20 years old and turn them over to FDLE's crime lab for analysis. They did not come up with a sample that would identify a suspect, though.
They won't identify a suspect, or
Ma'am?
they didn't identify him, or they won't, or is there just nobody in the database?
The DNA after 20 years blood samples or something. I'm no chemist, but it just, yeah, that didn't work. Anyone else?
Raise your hand if you have a question.
We'll ask that you stand up when gets through.
I don't have a question, but I might add something to it. Bob Sims was not only my boss, but my best friend. And I was Jenny Sims was babysitting for me that night. And yeah, I'm Everett Yarborough. Anyway, we were at the football game, and we were going out Stadium Drive, and it was just packed with people, and I couldn't get out, and we sat there for 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know how long it was. And anyway, I finally looked around at Pensacola Street, and it was wide open, so I turned and went home. And like a good father, I waited till she got safely in the house. We think with the murderer, she thought she heard the back door slam when it went out. But I've always been convinced that if we hadn't been delayed, she would have been killed too. So, but Bob was a really great guy, my best friend. We'd go to his house and play pinochle. He didn't want to play with his wife, and I didn't want to play with mine. So, but this business of her having an affair, I don't believe that for a second. These were two people that loved each other, and but anyway, I could go on and tell you great stories. Just a couple of little things. That his name was Robert Wilson Sims, and if you know people from Mississippi, they don't do that. They call it R.W. And but we called him Bob. And to show you what a great guy he was, he hired me at the Department of Education, and he said, this was 1963, and to a salary of $8,000. But I got my appointment. It said $8,500. I got a $500 raise before I ever showed up. And there's many more stories like that that he was just a great guy, and he looked after it. And he was a visionary as far as data processing, we called it at that time. We were the leaders in the country in student data, and it was all his visionary thing that got it done. Anyway, I could go on, but I'll give it to somebody else.
Thank you, sir.
I was just going to ask, where are these people now? I mean, she's still in Jacksonville, he's still in St. Pete. Are they still alive? There seems like a lot of hope that they'll break after all this time.
Yeah. Well, they are still alive as far as I know. She's still in Jacksonville. He's still, I guess, in St. Petersburg. I don't know. I have not been in contact with them. Even the Sheriff's Department had to do some real police work to find them. But the other suspects, several of them are dead or otherwise gone. Yes.
The parents were each shot, but the younger daughter was brutalized and then shot. And I'm just wondering if that was part of the investigation, and as how that may have been different from her parents.
Let me see. I think all of them have been gagged with stockings. The parents were just shot. The little girl was shot and slashed severely with a double-edged knife, which that was one of the things Sheriff Campbell, or Major Campbell at the time, discovered that this kid did have a double-edged knife, real fancy thing that he might have used, but they never recovered any of the murder weapons. I don't know what was different about the girl, except I think might have been, she may have been the object that the killers were after. I think that she was. Sir.
I'm Bob Davis. I was working in Tallahassee at that time. My wife and I both, we drove back and forth from right outside of Chattahoochee over here every day. And one of the things that I remember, and I would like to clarify from maybe Mr. Woods or someone regarding that the contamination of evidence, failure to seal off the crime scene and things like that, which seemed to be an overreaching indictment of the law enforcement agencies that handled this thing. That was a rumor that was running wild among a bunch of others at that particular time, as well as was the rumor about Dr. Fox and all of that. But I would like for you or someone to address the issue regarding the contamination of evidence.
Addressing what?
At the rumor was that the crime scene was not sealed off until the following day. And
Okay.
it seems like I said, an overreaching indictment of the law enforcement agencies that were handling the case. And I just wanted some comment to the facts of that.
Okay, I understand, and yes, you're right. That there was some criticism about that. That some said the investigating officers made a pot of coffee. Some neighbors walked in and out of the house. There were cigarette butts in the ashtrays and whatnot. But in all fairness, Tallahassee had never had a crime like this before. I mean, the police, I don't think, had been trained in forensics like they have today and protecting the crime scene. And in fairness to the sheriff, yeah, they could have been better, and it would have been more sterile a scene than it was back then. But like before he died, the sheriff said if that crime happened today, we'd have somebody in jail tomorrow. But he, like all the rest of us, has to play the cards that gets dealt. Okay, I can tell one or more. How about that? Then, yes, ma'am.
This devastated my family also. We lived at 638 Muriel Court, and my daughter was Joy's best friend. They were in the same grade at Rudiger. When we were left to go to the football game that night, we left Joy and my daughter Lori playing on our lawn. They were doing gymnastics. And then my daughter told me that she went over and she enjoyed playing the piano. And then she came home. She was almost 12. This was the first time we had ever left her alone. She begged not to have a babysitter since she was so old, and we left her alone. And we came home from the football game, and we got ready to go to bed, and as we came by, she stayed in the family room where the children had made a tent and decided to sleep in there. We went on to the bedroom. We left her there, and all of a sudden, all the cars, police cars were outside, and her father called Bill, who he knew, and said, "What's going on?" And when he told us, we went racing back to the family room to see her. We had no idea what we would find. And they found fingerprints around our windows that they couldn't identify. So, but like I said, my daughter's been fearful ever since, and she found black gloves in her father's dresser drawer, and with all the TV, where they put the black gloves on, she thought her daddy had done it, And like I said, our whole cul-de-sac there, our peaceful little circle was really hurt by this. And we lost our home because of this, because the children could not stay there. Every time we drove up, I had to go in the house and look under everything and tell them it was clear. And we couldn't sell the house, so we just had to give it back to the bank. And I just want to tell you, it hurt a lot of people. And the Simses were wonderful people. I just can't imagine anybody killing them. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
My name is Beverly Gaines Farrell, and I actually was best friends with Vernon Fox's sister Lorraine and spent many nights in their house. I also went to school with Mary Charles, and yeah, she was a nutcase. But you know, to know Vernon, it's just like people who knew Ted Bundy. You would never figure him to do something like that. So imagine my shock when I hear, you know, one of my best friend's brothers is possibly accused of this, you know, and his dad was a professor of criminology at FSU who taught many people, and his mother was a teacher at Leon. And we lived not too far from there, and it was really, it still haunts me to this day, you know, to think that this is the person that could have done this.
Awesome.
Thank you for sharing that.
One more down here, this gentleman. And we'll this be the last one.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you for the opportunity to let me speak. My name is Jack Pottinger. I retired from the State Attorney's Office as the Chief Assistant State Attorney under Willie Meggs. In 1977, I joined Sheriff Ken Katsaris with the Leon County Sheriff's Office. I was the Chief of Detectives with the Leon County Sheriff's Office. During that period of time, Theodore Robert Bundy came to town and took up 2.5 years of our time dealing with that. I commanded the task force that ultimately arrested it and had him convicted and executed. During that period of time, also, right before we left office, we were a one-term sheriff. Eddie Boone beat us, and that's good. I like Eddie. He's a good man. But in any event, before we left, I went ahead and assigned some of my investigators and myself to look at the Sims murder case. And if you look at some of the documents that maybe you've been provided, you'll see that we did send a whole list of questions to FDLE regarding all of that. And most of which came back, well, it's negative, we didn't find this, we didn't find that. And the DNA somebody asked about, they said it was too degraded. Now, interestingly enough, that was in 1979, 80 perhaps. It wasn't until 1988 when I tried the murder of Officer Ponce de Leon that we actually used DNA for the first time in the state of Florida as a tool to convict the person who killed him. So at that time, DNA was not. Today, it's progressed 1,000% over what we had. So may there still be DNA? Perhaps. Should we take another look at it? Perhaps. Unfortunately, the scene was a very bloody scene, so a lot of the blood that you're going to find there is going to be the victim's blood. To my recollection, there was only one semen stain found. I do not know the results of what that semen stain would be today if we used DNA on it. Now, I was wondering, do you have any documentation that was provided to you regarding Thomas Fulgham and what that was utilized to indicate that he was not a suspect?
That was used in relation to the Sims case?
Yeah.
Yeah, Fulgham. I got documents that are pretty much focused on the murder in Georgia and his actions up there. Other than the fact that he attended this regular or rather rowdy party of teenagers in the neighborhood that night and left there with some friends and wasn't exactly sure what he did the rest of the night, but there's no fingerprints or other evidence to indicate he was ever in the Sims house.
I have a concern with Mr. Fulgham. And the reason being is, as I look back through the file, whatever file we had at the time when I was with the sheriff's office, I noticed that Mr. Fulgham, they attempted to interview him. He was a young man, and when they went to interview him, I think it was Investigator Dawkins, went to interview him, he was sick, and his mother would not allow him to be interviewed. Some time passed as they went about their business interviewing other people. The next time they came, he had run away from home. And this is the same individual that you talked about, went to Macon and attended chiropractic school. I learned of him from another investigator who was handling the murder in Georgia in which he eviscerated his girlfriend. And in fact, he carried her lung in a mayonnaise jar when he was found. And his finger was cut off and left inside the body cavity when he was cutting her up. His hand must have slipped and cut his finger off. I went to interview Mr. Fulgham, and before I did learn from his roommates that here was an individual that would wake up screaming in the middle of the night and eventually would say, they'd ask him, what's the problem, what's the matter? And he's talking about, he said, I did something, there's a murder of a family in Tallahassee and it bothers me. After that, I went to see him in prison, and as I walked in, he says, I know who you are. I said, you do? I said, who am I? He says, you're from Tallahassee. I said, all right. He says, I know why you're here. I said, you do? Why? Because you want to talk to me about a murder of a family in Tallahassee that happened many years ago. I said, is that right? He said, yeah, but I'm not going to talk to you. So he basically invoked his right to remain silent, which means at that point you got to cut off the interview, otherwise you get nothing out of it. It is my belief, and I have not seen anything to the contrary, Mr. Fulgham is a good person to look at. Now, I don't know what can be done or what has been done because I've not been privileged to receive any of the documents, and I've not looked into it because it's not my job at this point. I prosecute him, you arrest him, I'll convict him. But since that time, I've not seen any records. So I was just wondering if you had anything that showed how he was labeled not as a suspect in this case.
From what I remember, when he was being interviewed about the Sims murders, he was quick to point out, hey, this other murder, this woman in Georgia that I sliced up and put her liver in a jar and all this, I freely admitted all that. If I did that, then why wouldn't I admit the Sims murders? And I guess that's pretty good logic, but the fact that there was no other evidence I know of, maybe he is still a viable suspect, even though he's dead now, I understand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I've really enjoyed sharing this with you.
Please keep your seats for a moment, if you don't mind.
Have you ever looked into the fact that there was a Pippin Tom and
Okay, I think they're gone.
Mr. Sims had to leave
All right.
work,
Uh,
the murder to go
Thank you, Mr. Cabbage. We appreciate you being here. Could I have your attention just a moment? Could I have your attention just a moment, please? Could we have a little quiet?
About that, but I didn't.
My grandmother lived in the murder. That's how I know.
First of all, I want to thank Mr. Cabbage for what he has done tonight. We are the Tallahassee Historical Society, and we are embedded in history. This is a part of our history. This is a crime that took place almost 50 years ago, and you have brought us up to date. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate that. Next month, April the 9th at 7 p.m., we have another program you might be interested in. Our southern cousin, Brent Thurman, who's clerk of the court in Wakulla County, will bring us up to date on Wakulla County. You know, Wakulla County, Leon County used to extend to the Gulf of Mexico. For 19 years, it was Leon County property down there. So what Brent's going to do is bring us up to date on the historical facts there, and hopefully he can tell us whether or not they want to rejoin Leon County or not. So thank you so much for your attendance.